fellow in distress, but through he be the holiest son of God in his private ale. Let this be righted, and he will forsake his generous companions without apology. When his superior status is suitably acknowledged by those in power, the man of words usually finds all kinds of lofty reasons for siding with the strong against the weak. A Luther, who when first defining the established church spoke feelingly of the poor, simple, common folk, proclaimed later, when allied with the German princelings, that God would prefer to suffer the government to exist, no matter how evil, rather than to allow the rabble to riot, no matter how justified they are in doing so. A Burke patronized by lords and nobles spoke with a swinish multitude, and recommended to the poor patience, labor, sobriety, frugality, and religion. The pampered and flattered men of the words in Nazi Germany and Bolshevik Russia feel no impulsion to side with the persecuted and terrorized against the ruthless leaders and their secret police. 106. Whenever we find a dispensation enduring beyond its span of competence, there is either an entire abstinence of educated class or an intimate alliance between those in power and the men of words. See the book I mentioned before, Intellectual Treason, or Treason of the Intellectuals. Where all learned men are clergymen, the church is unassailable. Where all learned men are bureaucrats, or where education gives men an acknowledged superior status, the prevailing order is likely to be free from movements of protest. The Catholic Church sank to its lowest level in the 10th century, at the time of Pope John. It was then far more corrupt and ineffectual than at the time of the Reformation. But in the 10th century, all learned men were priests. Whereas in the 15th century, as a result of introduction of printing and paper, learning had ceased to be the monopoly of the Church. It was non-clerical humanists who formed the vanguard of the Reformation. Those of the scholars affiliated with the Church, or who as in Italy enjoyed the patronage of the Pope, showed a tolerant spirit and the hold toward existing institutions, including the ecclesiastical abuses, and in general cared little how long the vulgar herd was left in the superstitious darkness which befitted their state. The stability of imperial China, like the ancient Egypt, was due to an intimate alliance between the bureaucracy and the literati. It is of an interest that the Taiping Rebellion, the only effective Chinese mass movement while the empire was still a going concern, was started by a scholar who failed again and again in the state examination for the highest Mandarin caste. The long endurance of the Roman Empire was due in some degree to the wholehearted partnership between the Roman rulers and the Greek men of words. The conquered Greeks felt that they gave laws and civilization to the conquerors. It is disconcerting to read how the deformed and depraved Nero, who was extravagant in his admiration of Hellas, was welcomed hysterically by the Greeks in his visit in 67 AD. They took him to their hearts as a fellow intellectual and artist. To gratify him, all the games had been crowded into a single year. All the cities sent him the prizes of their contests. Committees were continually waiting on him to beg him to go and sing at every place. And he in turn loaded them with privileges and proclaimed the freedoms of Greece at the Isthmian Games. In his study of history, Professor A.J. Toynbee, Toynbee, quotes the Latin hexamasters which Claudian of Alexandria wrote in praise of Rome almost 500 years after Caesar set foot on Egyptian soil, and he adds ruefully, "It would be easy to prove that the British Raj had been in many respects a more benevolent and also perhaps a more beneficent institution than the Roman Empire, but would it be hard to find a Claudian in any of the Alexandrians of Hindustan. Now it is not altogether far-fetched to assume that had the British in India, instead of cultivating the Nazims, Maharajas, Nawabs, Gurkhas, and so on, made an effort to win the Indian intellectual, had they treated him as an equal, encouraged him in his work, and allowed him to share of the flesh pots, they could perhaps have maintained their rule there indefinitely. As it was, the British who ruled India were of a type altogether lacking of the aptitude for getting along with intellectuals in any land, and least of all in India. They were men of action. Did I just say They were men of action, imbued with a faith in the innate superiority of the British. For the most part, they scorned the Indian intellectual, both as a man of words and as an Indian. The British in India tried to preserve the realm of action for themselves. They did not, to any real extent, encourage the Indians to become engineers, agrimonists, or technicians. The educational institutions they established produced impractical men of words, and it is an irony of fate that this system, instead of safeguarding British rule, hastened its end. Britain's failure in Palestine was also due in part to the lack of rapport between typical British colonial official officials, and men of words. The majority of Palestinian Jews, although steeped in action, are by upbringing and tradition men of words and thin-skinned to a fault. They smarted under the contemptuous attitude of the British official, who looked on the Jews as on a pack of unmanly and ungrateful quibblers, an easy prey for the warlike Arabs once Britain with Jewish protective hand. Palestinian Jews also resented the tutelage of mediocre officials, their inferiors in both experience and intelligence. Britons of the caliber of Julian Huxley, Harold Nicholson, or Richard Crossman just possibly might have saved Palestine for the Empire. In both the Bolshevik and Nazi regimes, there is evident of acute awareness of the fateful relation between men of words and the state. In Russia, men of letters, artists, and scholars share the privileges of the ruling group. They are all superior civil servants, and though made to toe the party line, they are but subject to the same discipline imposed on the rest of the elite. In the case of Hitler, there was a diabolical realism in his plan to make all learning the monopoly of the elite, which was to rule his envisioned world empire, and to keep the anonymous masses barely literate. 107. The men of letters of 18th century France are the most familiar example of intellectuals pioneering a mass movement. A somewhat similar pattern may be detected in the periods preceding the rise of most movements. The ground for the Reformation was prepared by the men who satirized and denounced the clergy in popular pamphlets, and by men of letters like Jonathan Reuchlin, Reuchlin, who fought and discredited the Roman Curia. The rapid spread of Christianity in the Roman world was partly due to the fact that the pagan cults it sought to supplement were already thoroughly discredited. The discrediting was done before and after the birth of Christianity by the Greek philosophers who were bored with the plurality of the cults and denounced and ridiculed them in schools and city streets. Christianity made little headway against Judaism because the Jewish religion had the ardent allegiance of the Jewish men of words. The rabbis and their disciples enjoyed an exalted status in Jewish life of that day, where the school and the books supplemented the temple and the fatherland. In any social order where the reign of men of words is so supreme, no opposition can develop within, and no foreign mass movement can gain a foothold. The mass movement of modern time, whether socialist or nationalist, were inevitably pioneered by poets, writers, historians, scholars, philosophers, and the like. The connection between intellectual theoreticians and revolutionary movements needs no emphasis, but it is equally true that all nationalist movements, from the cult of La Parte in revolutionary France to the latest nationalist rising in Indonesia, were conceived not by men of action, but by fault-finding intellectuals. The generals, industrialists, landowners, and businessmen who are considered pillars of patriotism are latecomers to join the movement after it has become a going concern. The most strenuous effort of the early phase of every nationalist movement consists in convincing and winning over these future pillars of patriotism. The Czech historian Palacky said that if the ceiling of a room in which he and a handful of friends were dining one night had collapsed, there would have been no Czech nationalist movement. Such handfuls of impractical men of words were at the beginning of all nationalist movements. German intellectuals were the originators of German nationalism, just as Jewish intellectuals were the originators of Zionism. It is the deep-seated craving of the man of words for an exalted status which makes him oversensitive to any humiliation imposed on the class or community, racial, lingual, or religious, to which he belongs, however loosely. It was Napoleon's humiliation of the Germans, particularly the Persians, which drove Fichte and the German intellectuals to call on the German masses to unite in a mighty nation which would dominate Europe. Theodor Herzl and the Jewish intellectuals were driven to Zionism by the humiliation heaped upon millions of Jews in Russia, and by the calamities to which the Jews in the rest of the continental Europe were subjected toward the end of the 19th century. To agree, the nationalist movement which forced the British rulers out of India had its inception in the humiliation of a scrawny and bespectacled Indian man of words in South Africa. 108. It is easy to see how the fault-finding man of words, by persistent ridicule and denunciation, shakes prevailing beliefs and loyalties and familiarizes the masses with the ideas of change. What is not so obvious is the process by which the discrediting of existing beliefs and institutions makes possible the rise of a new fanatical faith. For it is a remarkable fact that the militant man of words, who sounds the established order to its source to mark its want of authority and justice, often prepares the ground not for a society of free-thinking individuals, but for a corporate society that cherishes utmost unity and blind faith. A wide diffusion of doubt and irreverence thus leads often to unexpected results. The irreverence of the Renaissance was a prelude to the new fanaticism of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation. The Frenchmen of the Enlightenment, who debunked the Church and the Crown and preached reason and tolerance, released a burst of revolutionary nationalist fanaticism which has not abated yet. Marx and his followers discredited religion, nationalism, and the passionate pursuit of business, and brought into being a new fanaticism of socialism, communism, Stalinist nationalism, and the passion for world domination or dominion. When we debunk a fanatical faith or prejudice, we do not strike at the root of fanaticism, we merely prevent its leaking out at a certain point, with the likely result that it will leak out at some other point. Thus, by denigrating prevailing beliefs and loyalties, the militant man of words unwittingly creates in the disillusioned masses a hunger for faith. For the majority of people cannot endure the barrenness and futility of their lives unless they have some ardent dedication or some passionate pursuit in which they can lose themselves. Thus, in spite of himself, the scoffing man of words becomes the precursor of a new faith. The genuine man of words himself can get along without faith in absolutes. He values the search for truth as much as truth itself. He delights in the clash of thought and in the give and take of controversy. If he formulates a philosophy and a doctrine, they are more exhibition of brilliance and an exercise in dialects than a program of action and tenets of a faith. His vanity, it is true, often prompts him to defend his speculations with savagery and even venom, but his appeal is usually to reason and not to faith. The fanatics and the faith-hungry masses, however, are likely to invest such speculations with the certitude of Holy Writ, to make them the fountainhead of a new faith. Jesus was not a Christian, nor was Marx a Marxist. To sum up, the militant man of words prepares the ground for the rise of a mass movement. 1. By discrediting prevailing creeds and institutions, and detaching from them the allegiance of the people. 2. By indirectly creating a hunger for faith in the hearts of those who cannot live without it, so that when the new faith is preached, it finds an eager response among the disillusioned masses. 3. By furnishing the doctrine and the slogans for the new faith. 4. By undermining the convictions of the better people, those who can get along without faith, so that when the new fanaticism makes its appearance, they are without the capacity to resist it. They see no sense in dying for convictions and principles, and yield to a new order without a fight. Thus, when the irrelevant intellectual has done his work, the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The stage is now set for the fanatics. 109. The tragic figures in history of a mass movement are often the intellectual precursors who live long enough to see the downfall of the old order by the action of the masses. The impression that mass movements and revolutions in particular are born of the resolve of the masses to overthrow corrupt and oppressive tyranny and win for themselves freedom of action, speech, and conscience has its origins in the din of words let loose by the intellectual originators of the movement in their skirmishes with the prevailing order. The fact that mass movements, as they arise, often manifest less individual freedom than the order they supplement is usually ascribed to the trickery of a power-hungry clique that kidnaps the movement at a critical stage and cheats the masses of the freedom about to dawn. Actually, the only people cheated in the process are the intellectual precursors. They rise against the established order, deride its irrationality and incompetence, denounce its illegitimacy and oppressiveness, and call for freedom of all self-expression and self-realization. They take it for granted that the masses who respond to their call and range themselves behind them crave the same thing. However, the freedom of the masses crave is not freedom of self-expression and self-realization, but freedom from the intolerable burden of an autonomous existence. They want freedom from the fearful burden of free choice, freedom from the audacious responsibility of realizing their ineffectual selves and shouldering the blame for blemished product. They do not want freedom of conscience, but faith, blind authoritarian faith. They sweep away the old order, not to create a society of free and independent men, but to establish uniformity, individual anonymity, and a new structure of a perfect unity. It is not the wickedness of the old regime they rise against, but its weakness, not its oppression, but its failure to hammer them together into one solid, mighty whole. The persuasiveness of the intellectual demagogue consists not so much in convicting people of the vileness of the established order as in demonstrating its helpless incompetence. The immediate result of a mass movement usually corresponds to what the people want. They are not cheated in the process. The reason for the tragic fate which almost always overtakes the intellectual midwives of a mass movement is that no matter how much they preach and glorify the unified effort, they remain essentially individualists. They believe in the possibility of individual happiness and the validity of individual opinion and initiative. But once a movement gets rolling, power falls into the hands of those who have neither faith in nor respect for the individual. And the reason they prevail is not so much that their disregard of the individual gives them a capacity for ruthlessness, but that their attitude is in full accord with the ruling passion of the masses. 110. The Fanatics. When the moment is ripe, only the fanatic can hatch a genuine mass movement. Without him, the dissatisfaction engendered by the militant men of words remains undirected and can vent itself only in pointless and easily suppressed disorders.